Hey guys, welcome to the Fairelia Files, where we talk about all things unsolved and unearthly. So today we are discussing 4 times when there was someone in the attic and it wasn't just creaking or weird noises that you heard. So let's get into our first story. So our first story takes place in 1941. Helen was in the hospital. She was recovering from a broken hip, so she was there for the long haul, essentially. And her husband was visiting her, and when he went home one night, he saw some man digging through his fridge. This man, he had no idea who he was, so before Philip could do anything, the man attacked him with a stove shaker, which is a piece of an old cast iron stove, and he beat Philip to death. So after a few days, the neighbors were really concerned that they hadn't seen Philip because it was unusual to not see him on most days. So they went over to the house and they found Philip's body. They called the police, but when the police came, there was no sign of forced entry, no clues, and no explanation on how the killer had gotten in or out. So when Helen returned home, knowing her husband was dead, she was home alone in the house. She and her neighbors, oddly, began reporting strange noises and foul odors coming from the house. And every time she called the police, they came over, they looked, and they found nothing. So finally, Helen moved out maybe a year or so later, but the neighbors kept calling. They kept calling the police saying there's strange noises, there's bad odors, we see something in the house. But still, every time the police came over, there was nothing. And it wasn't until July of 1942, after numerous phone calls from the neighbors, that 2 officers were posted outside the house. And one night they're standing there, and out of the corner of their eye, they see a man in the house. So they rush in, just in time to see a pair of skinny legs vanishing into an attic trapdoor. They caught a man called Theodore Coonies, who confessed to the murder of Philip and said that he'd been living in the attic for months, sneaking down to steal their food. So if that isn't creepy when you have someone living in your house, coming down at night to steal your food, I mean, how do you not notice this? How do you not know that your leftovers are gone or you're missing a can of food here or there? Do you really just think you're going that crazy? All right, well, let's get into it with story number 2. This one's a little bit more recent, and we are headed down under to Melbourne, Australia, where Jenny has just moved into her new 1-bedroom apartment. Well, it was new to her. The area was filled with old brick buildings that had been built in the 1930s, but were still in pretty good shape. But that didn't matter much to Jenny. This was her first apartment and her first time living alone, which was exciting and terrifying at the same time. A few months after moving in, Jenny came home from work, put her things down on the counter, and walked over to the bathroom. But she stopped short at the door. A wooden board which had covered the attic access hole was lying broken on the floor. Looking up, she didn't see anything, but it was dark up there and she couldn't see really well from her angle. Carefully, she bent down and checked out the board. It was almost an inch thick and would have taken someone like Bruce Lee to break it. She doubted that the 8-foot fall from the ceiling would have cracked this board in half. But what else could it have been? Feeling like she was being watched, she looked up into the dark hole in the ceiling. Calling herself a scaredy cat, she settled on the idea that the landlord must have sent someone over to work in the area while she was out and had forgotten to tell her. A bit peeved, she took some pictures and emailed them to the landlord, asking if anyone had been up there, letting her annoyance show that she hadn't been told. Within a few minutes, the landlord had emailed back, but the email just read, "Please call me as soon as you're able to." I mean, what is that? What kind of response is that? So Jenny is flustered, and she calls her landlord back, but what the landlord said took the wind right out of her sails. The landlord explained that the same board had fallen in the same way for the last 2 tenants. No explanation of how or why the board kept falling, but Jenny was reassured that it would get fixed. With the board secured in the ceiling, a month goes by until one night Jenny's woken up at 4 a.m. covered in goosebumps. It wasn't the cold that had given her the goosebumps, because that night was decently warm. I mean, it's Australia. It was the goosebumps you get when the hair stands up from fear. Jenny felt like someone was rubbing their hands on her, but no one was there. Everything else in the apartment was silent. And then she heard a dragging sound coming from above her bed. It sounded like someone was dragging a sack of potatoes. She froze, convinced that someone was in the attic above her apartment. There's no way an animal could make that kind of sound. After 5 minutes of talking to herself, she convinces herself to get out of bed, take the few steps to turn on the light, and grabbed her cricket bat. She then made her way to the bathroom. With her back against the wall, she peeked around the corner and into the bathroom. She froze. The board from the ceiling was on the floor, broken in two. She felt sick. Right then, the dragging sound stopped and a new sound began. Whispering. The sound was clear and definitely coming from the attic. It sounded like children were saying, "It's your turn. It's your turn," over and over again. Shaking her head, she got a hold of herself and turned on every light in the apartment to try to make things feel normal. It was only 5 a.m. and still dark outside, so the lights were comforting. Jenny walked over to the couch, pulled her knees up to her chest, and turned on the TV to try to forget about what had happened. It couldn't be real. She had to have made it up. It was just a bad dream. Then a fuse blew, and all the lights went out. Jenny's pet bird, Dexter, who was in the kitchen, started squawking loudly, like he was being strangled. She'd never heard her bird make that kind of noise before. She grabbed her car keys and ran out the door to her car, where she stayed until the sun came up. When people started coming out to walk their dogs and begin their mornings, Jenny felt safe enough to go back to her apartment. As she walked down the hallway to her apartment, she saw that the door was open, but she figured she must have left it open when she hauled ass out of there a few hours ago. Her first stop when she walked into the apartment was the kitchen. She wanted to check on Dexter. As she walked up to his cage, she didn't see him. She looked on the bottom of the cage, but he wasn't in the cage at all. The same feeling of sickness she had just a few hours ago came back. She knew all the windows were closed, so she began looking all over her apartment for Dexter. When she checked the bathroom, she heard splashing. The bird was half drowned in the toilet. Scooping him out, she brought him to the sink and rinsed him off and dried him. Jenny couldn't figure out how he had gotten in there. It's now about 8 a.m., so she grabs her phone and calls the landlord. Jenny gives her a watered-down version of the night she just had, and her landlord came back with the most unexpected reply and said, "Oh, wow, you heard the whispering too?" After that night, Jenny stayed in the apartment for another 18 months before she moved out. She would occasionally hear whispering, and twice she noticed that the board covering the hole in the ceiling had moved. Later on, the apartment was rented to new tenants who were hearing whispers and the dragging sounds at night, and they really wanted to talk to Jenny and hear about her experiences, but she wanted nothing to do with the apartment anymore. Okay, so let's get into story 3. In 1995, when Emily was 20, she moved to a small farming town in the state of Washington to be closer to her brother and his family. She rented an apartment, and the room was on the top floor, but on her first night, laying in bed, she heard footsteps above her. Over the months, she started to notice things going missing. She'd buy a 6-pack of soda, drink one, come home from work, and find only 4 left. It was the same with packets of soup and ramen noodles. She also noticed that doors she had left open were closed, or vice versa. If she had closed a door, she'd find it open. Mostly, she found it amusing. She really thought that her brother, who had a key, was coming over and eating her food. Looking back, she should have known it wasn't him because there would have been dirty dishes everywhere. So she got a puppy. And while the puppy was being toilet trained, she stayed in the bathroom. One day, when she was out, the apartment flooded. She came home to find the puppy in the sink. She was tiny, and she didn't know how the puppy could have gotten up there unless someone had put her there to save her. I mean, just a tiny little puppy. She continued to hear footsteps. There was a hatch in the ceiling leading to what she assumed was an attic. She asked her landlady if there was any way someone could be up there, and she said, "No way. It's probably just a squirrel or raccoons." So she pushed it out of her mind. Then one day, she called in sick to work. She laid on the couch all day, and around 11 p.m., she turned off the lights, lit a candle, and ran a bath. As she laid in the water, she noticed the attic hatch was open. Suddenly, everything slowed way down. What took about 30 seconds felt like 5 minutes. All the puzzle pieces started falling into place. The footsteps, the food, the puppy. Someone was in her apartment. Her first thought was, if they had wanted me dead, I would be dead. They had access to her for 6 months. She assumed it must be a man or someone tall enough to get up there without a ladder. And she knew she had to stay cool and not scare him in case he hurt her. She walked naked to the bedroom to get her robe, passing the mirrored closet she suspected he was hiding in. And then she went to the kitchen, got a hammer out of the junk drawer for protection, and called her sister-in-law. She whispered, "I think there's someone in my house." She said, "Get out now, I'm on my way." 3 minutes later, she was outside. When they went back into her house, they called the cops. They didn't find anyone, but there was a nest of stuff in the attic. A sleeping bag, some food, and a book, though they never told her what he was reading. And then the next day, she told her landlady she was moving out and gave her a copy of the police report, which noted signs of possible intrusion. So this chick really lived with someone in her attic. It's almost like having a roommate, but she didn't know about him. And apparently neither did the landlady. And that seems to be a growing theme, that the landladies never seem to know that there's someone in the attic. And then they rent all these places to young women, and they're the ones who have to find out the hard way. So let's move on to our last story. And this story comes from Bavaria in the 1920s. It's a pretty popular story where Andreas had been hearing odd creaks and footsteps in the attic for months, but he assumed the house was settling, or worse, haunted. I mean, they live in Bavaria. There's a lot of snow. There's a lot of wind and leaves. So why would you expect anything else? Your whole family lives in the house. There's nothing to really think about. And then he was looking out the window one day and noticed footprints that were leading to the house, but they weren't leaving the house. And a few days later, he noticed a newspaper on the table, but he didn't buy that newspaper. It wasn't one that he would have bought anyway, or anything that his family would have bought. It was just kind of out of place. So he filed it in the back of his head. And then the keys to his tool shed went missing. This brings up a bit of alarm, because who's trying to steal my tools? Who's trying to get into the tool shed where I keep all the important stuff for the farm? So days passed and no one noticed anything out of place, except that the daughter missed a few days of school and the mail was starting to pile up. The mailman was kind of getting frustrated. He couldn't fit any more in the mailbox. So when the police finally arrived to do their courtesy check, they discovered that the entire family, along with their maid, had been brutally murdered. 4 of the bodies were stacked in the barn. The killer? Still unknown, till this day. But what's worse, neighbors had seen smoke from the chimney and livestock had been fed in the days after the murders. The killer was likely living in the attic for about 6 months prior and had stayed living in the house long after the family was gone. So all of these people were living in their house with another man living in their attic. I mean, when I had an attic, I know I didn't go up there often, but you go up there every month or so to check or to get something down. It's not like it's lost forever. But these people did they never go into their attic? I mean, I can get the rental apartments, and if it's supposed to be boarded up, you're not supposed to be going in there. Yeah, but as soon as it came down twice, that would have been it. I mean, I probably would have screwed it in myself, added a few extra screws, made sure that stayed up there, put a lock on it or something to make sure that it stayed and that it wasn't just bad screws, bad wood, or something like that. I mean, what would you guys have done? Would you guys have stayed in those apartments feeling like there's someone in your apartment? I mean, I get it if you don't have any other place to go, but stay with a friend for a few nights and see what happens. See, kind of set up the scene, see if anything gets taken. I don't know. I would just be totally creeped out. But now, anytime that I hear noises or creaking, it makes me wonder, is there someone up there? Or is it the wind, raccoons, or squirrels? I leave that up to you. And if you guys have any stories about someone hiding in an attic, be sure to tell me in the comments and let everyone else know. Alright guys, I will see you next time on the Feyrelia Files.